As you might have guessed, one of the major differences between these two types of tradition involves the type of reasoning that provide the foundation for each of these traditions. Naturalistic inquiry is based on inductive reasoning, which requires the investigator to produce a universal claim or some sort of principle or theory from what they're seeing in front of them. We might ask, what's happening in the sample? What's happening in my clinic? And is there anything that I can derive from my observations about a broader theory? On the other hand, an experimental or quantitative tradition relies on deductive reasoning. And this is basically the opposite of inductive reasoning. This is the use of a universal claim to predict observed instances. Oftentimes we'll use a universal claim in the form of a theory and test its ability to predict what we would see in a single circumstance. So questions here might involve, how does the theory that I'm using actually predict what's going to happen in my sample or in my clinic? Here's another way of looking at inductive reasoning. You may notice that individuals with dementia tend to become very agitated in the hour around sundown. And you may have been in practice for 20 years and have noticed this as a consistent phenomenon. It may occur to you that a broad conceptual statement is in order, and that changes in light and shadow contribute to a confusing environmental message that's upsetting to an individual with dementia, and therefore is manifested in the form of sundowning. Compare that to deductive reasoning, where you're actually beginning with that universal truth, in this case a conceptual framework by Lawton and Nehemo that says behavior is a function of competence in relationship to environmental press. That means that we behave in a way that relies on what we are able to do and the messages from the environment. So applying that to an individual's circumstances would suggest that adjusting the environment will reduce the number and severity of disruptive behaviors demonstrated by individuals with dementia. The arrows go the opposite way in deductive reasoning as they do in inductive reasoning. So we've started out our discussion by taking a look at the type of reasoning that's used by both these traditions, which is one of the first of 9 characteristics that you will see in this chart, and one of the first of 9 characteristics that differentiate these two traditions. Naturalistic, using an inductive type of reasoning, and experimental, using a deductive type of reasoning. Other types of characteristics where these two traditions differ is their epistemology, the purpose of the tradition, the process used, the setting, the role of the investigator, the type of data collected, the sources of rigor and accuracy, and the use of writing. Let's go through each of these one at a time. What is an epistemology? An epistemology is the nature of knowledge. It's how we actually think about knowing what we know. For example, a naturalistic epistemology sees reality as something that's constructed by the people that are actually living that reality. That my reality is different from your reality, and the actor is an important part of that reality. And so we can only understand reality by having the person who is living it tell us about it. That way, the epistemology is that reality or truth or knowing has to be holistic. We have to understand everything about that person's experience or the phenomena of interest. We can't just boil it down to one simple little relationship between two parts. Naturalistic epistemology also requires us to think a great deal about the context. Where is this taking place? How do we understand the reality constructed by that individual in terms of its relationship to things that happened before and may happen after, or the physical context, or certainly the social context? So the epistemology of a naturalistic tradition is this holistic, constructionist, contextual type of way of knowing. On the other hand, an experimental epistemology is very logical in terms of moving in one direction. A equals B equals C, and that all causes D. It's also very positive that the information can be separated from the individual and that only a single reality exists so that we can measure it. We can stand back from the individual. We can be very objective. We don't need to know what they think about it, how they're experiencing it. We can do a measurement, and we can find this single reality that exists separate from the individual. Another difference between these two traditions is the very purpose of research. In a naturalistic tradition, we're trying very hard to describe the human experience, and so that has to be constructed by the individual. We also use this to generate theory, because if you're looking at a number of individual circumstances and trying to extrapolate to a more universal claim, that is the same type of approach that you would use to generate theory. On the other hand, the purpose of research, because we're trying to use a universal claim to predict what's happening in a single circumstance, the purpose of research in this case is to predict what will happen in that single circumstance, to explain what is happening by showing how it relates to a theory, or to actually test a theory. Now this might be the place where you realize that these two types of research can work together. If you generate a theory based on a naturalistic tradition, you may be able to use an experimental tradition to actually test the theory. The research process from one tradition to another looks very, very different. In a naturalistic type of approach, you're looking at great depth at what's happening with a particular person, but it may only be one person, or it may be 2 people or 3 people, but it's a very small sample no matter what. So you end up looking at a very narrow slice of reality as constructed by those individuals, but in great depth. So it tends to look like a long, narrow triangle. On the other hand, an experimental tradition does not look in great depth. It may look at one variable in relationship to another, but we're looking across a number of individuals. So it's more of a long, horizontal, skinny type of process. Let's look at that another way. The naturalistic research process is said to be spiral. So we begin at the top left with observations, and we use those observations to form some sort of construct. We then, after looking at the construct and thinking about the theory that we've developed based on our observations, we generate a hypothesis. And then we test that hypothesis by taking more observations. Our observations then lead us to refining our thinking, and we go back and are able to refine our construct development. So you may not have the same observations at each one of those points, but that's okay because really you are using the observations to refine your construct and understand it better. On the other hand, an experimental research process is very linear. You begin by defining the problem statement and all the important constructs and concepts. You identify a theoretical foundation, and actually these two steps can be inverted. You use your theoretical foundation to identify and name and frame your variables. You then develop a research question and hypothesis, and you design the study. It's not often that you go back and recreate any of these steps, but it's possible. That all changes when you come to the point of collecting data. Once you get to the data collection stage, you cannot go back and change your research question and hypothesis. You can't identify a new theoretical foundation. You have to go ahead with the path that you've established. The data collection stops, and only at that point can you begin to analyze the data, never before. And then finally, when the data are all analyzed, that's the first point when you can actually report your findings. Let's look at another characteristic that differs between these two traditions, the setting. In a naturalistic tradition, the setting is wherever the phenomena of interest takes place. So if this behavior or this experience is actually happening in the home or the schoolroom or the classroom, that's where the phenomena of interest needs to be examined. An experimental setting involves the place where the phenomena of interest can best be controlled. And it may be sometimes that these are really just exactly the same two settings. But there's a different approach in an experimental type of tradition to controlling what's going on as opposed to a naturalistic. Let me give you an example of that. In a naturalistic setting, I may choose to go to an informant's home and ask them about what it's like to be the mother of a young child with some sort of mobility problem. And what I'm interested in doing, because I like the context, is I really want to get a flavor of everything that happens in that home. So if the children come home from school and are running through the house and screaming and calling for a snack, or if the phone rings, or the dog barks, or somebody comes to the door, that's all rich information that I know is part of the whole phenomena that I'm trying to understand. And so I welcome that information. On the other hand, if I'm trying to conduct an intervention using an experimental tradition, and that also has to be carried out in the home, I'm certainly not going to try to schedule that visit for a time when all these other distractions will be happening. In fact, I'll try my best to make sure that we can decide on a time when the children are not going to be coming home from school and screaming. We'll take the phone off the hook, the animals will be locked up in the kitchen, and no one will answer the door. So you can see that even though the setting for both of these traditions in this example was the home, in one I am welcoming all the messy little aspects of the context, and in the other I'm trying to control them. Another difference in these two traditions is the nature of data. In a naturalistic tradition, the data includes anything except numbers. It usually involves text from an interview or observations, and that could be a video, it could be field notes. We can also be including photography, films, and so anything that you've seen by Ken Burns you can think of as a naturalistic documentary. Music is also a form of data in naturalistic traditions, and any other level of possibilities. Diaries, letters. If it's not numbers, then it's usually something that could be considered naturalistic data. On the other hand, in experimental tradition, the data are numbers, period. Now this is important for you to know. Either form of data can be converted to the other. And so the way you really decide what type of data it is the form that it takes when it's analyzed. So if you have naturalistic data in the form of interviews, you could count something about those interviews, convert it to numbers. It then becomes a numeric type of analysis. The nature of the data is numeric, and so we're analyzing it using a experimental approach, which is a statistical analysis. Let me give you another example. Let's say Dr. S has data from an open-ended questions on an interview. She finds that people are either talking about going to the circus, going to the store, or going to church. So she assigns a numeric code to those three categories of responses and then does a little frequency distribution. So even though she started off with naturalistic data, she converted it and ended up analyzing those data as experimental data. Dr. F counts the number of times the word family is used by informants in a study. So what should give this away is counting the number of times. Obviously he's going to come up with a total. What's he going to do with that total? He may do an average across all of the people that were in the study, or he may do something else. And then finally, Dr. Z codes an entire interview according to whether the information or the informants scored above the mean or below the mean on a depression scale. Now, I've done this myself. I would have an entire 90-minute interview, and I also have a questionnaire. And I find that I really am very interested to know what people with depression say about something and compare that to what people who do not have depression say about it. So I would go through and I would code the entire interview in terms of whether the person was above the level of depression or whether they were below a cutoff level of depression. And therefore I can go through and I can just sort my interviews according to those two different levels, and I look at the interviews and I compare what they're saying in the interviews. So I'm continuing my qualitative analysis, but I'm wrapping in the information that I got from my depression scale. So don't let this confuse you. If somebody collects data in one way and they convert it, you need to look at how they analyzed those data. Was it analyzed as numbers, or were they analyzed as words or pictures? And that will determine what the nature of the data are. The nature of the data is. Sources of rigor and accuracy. How do we know that what we're doing is done correctly, it's done accurately, and it's done in a way that's consistent with the principles of scientific inquiry in that particular tradition? In naturalistic tradition, we talk about being able to assure trustworthiness. And some of the ways that we do that is that we may try to gather information from a number of different sources. Say, for instance, I might have people talk to me about how they handle the homework time with a child with a disability, but I also may observe that as well. And I also may go talk to the spouse who's not usually handling the homework. And then from those three different sources, I'm able to converge or triangulate on the reality as it's constructed in that family. Trustworthiness also requires that somebody leave what we call an audit trail, which is just a memo and an ongoing log of how they thought about analysis, how they were thinking about the coding that was going on and putting those codes together as categories or themes. Trustworthiness in naturalistic study also involves going back to the informants after you've completed the study and asking them for their opinion on what you found, or going to content experts and asking them for opinions on what you found. So Dr. Green will talk more about trustworthiness in naturalistic research as we get into that. Next semester, you'll hear much more about the sources of rigor and accuracy in experimental designs, and this includes validity and reliability, internal and external validity, and all different types of reliability. So we'll leave it at that for now. Writing. What is the role of writing in each of these traditions? In a naturalistic tradition, writing really is the analysis. You don't just wait until the end after you've done other types of coding and thematic coding and other types of analysis and then write everything up. Very much that the writing occurs throughout the study and is a way of helping you to conduct that analysis. I've done several qualitative articles at this point, and it's always the case that as a result of doing those qualitative studies and writing them up, it's the writing them up that is the last level of analysis, and you have to get comfortable with that. In experimental tradition, that is absolutely not allowed, having writing being the analysis. And in fact, you don't even start writing until all the numbers have been crunched and all the p-values have been calculated and all the effect size. Writing in experimental tradition is dissemination. It occurs at specific times that follow specific phases of the analysis and not before. So to summarize each tradition, the 9 characteristics of a naturalistic tradition or qualitative is that it uses an inductive reasoning process, a holistic epistemology. The purpose is to describe something using a spiral research process. The setting is always naturalistic. The role of the investigator, which I realize that we really didn't talk about, is very subjective. The investigator is the tool by which data are collected and analysis is conducted. The 7th characteristic is that data is anything except numbers. So it can be pictures or text or so on. The 8th characteristic is that we try to gain accuracy and rigor through trustworthiness. And finally, that the role of writing is part of the analytic process. Let's look at those same 9 characteristics from an experimental perspective. We have a deductive reasoning process. The epistemology is logical positivism, that there's a reality out there to be known, and if we use a logical approach and get rid of all the extraneous factors, that we can get down to a very specific relationship between 2 or 3 variables. The purpose is to predict or to test something. It's a very linear process in a controlled setting. The investigator has to stay very objective. They cannot be involved in data collection. They can't be involved in analysis. They really are the planner. They kind of are the puppet master behind the scenes, but they really have to keep themselves very objective by not really being aware of some of the nuances of what's happening in the data collection and the analysis phase. Data in an experimental tradition are numbers, and accuracy and rigor is achieved through internal and external validity and reliability. People write for the purposes of disseminating information. Now, before we finish, there's really one more type to consider, and this is called mixed methods. And this is a situation where qualitative and quantitative traditions are combined. It's extremely powerful because it allows you to not only test a theory, but you can really dig a little bit deeper and begin to understand the processes that are at play in that theory. In a mixed methods, usually one or more tradition is the predominant tradition, because obviously if these traditions are opposite, then one of the traditions has to kind of lead the way. So you may have a situation where the qualitative study, predominantly a qualitative study, has a smaller quantitative component, or the opposite, where you have a quantitative or experimental study with a small qualitative component, maybe a couple of case studies. What's important here, and a challenge, and often not done very well, is being able to assure rigor and accuracy in both aspects of the design at the same time. One example of this mixed methods design using a primarily quantitative study with a qualitative component, and this, you may see that these symbols represent the symbols that we used when we talked about the shape of the research process, is we have a randomized, controlled, experimental design used to study the effectiveness of a new intervention. So that's that long, skinny rectangle. But we want to know how people really experienced being in that intervention. So we do a number of in-depth interviews to really begin to see how, say, men differed from women in the use of that behavioral intervention, or how people that were dealing with a situation a long time versus relative newcomers experience that particular intervention. This gives us a lot of information for the next time we try this intervention.